of you that didn't quite catch the fact, we're in Maui and we're enjoying it, and we should be all out here having this face to face. And because we're in Hawaii and we have people from Vermont and we have people from Massachusetts and all over, we have people literally from across the whole country joining us today. Welcome back, everyone who was here last week. I'm very sorry about those who couldn't see last week because of the lockout. Not sure exactly what happened, but you're not locked out today, so we're glad that you're here. This week's topic is mass incarceration and the war on drugs. Sue is going to record all of this, if you haven't already. Push the button. And I'm going to mute all of your microphones and then let Sue unmute hers so that she can talk. So Sue, take it away.
Okay. Well, hello again. It's good to see you all, and I'm so grateful to share this time with you as we together explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today, we focus on part 4 of 6, mass incarceration and the war on drugs. As we've seen in the history described in these past 3 weeks, the relationship between African Americans and our country's justice systems, both the legal and the extra legal versions, has been one of violence and oppression. The impunity with which these acts have been carried out echoes loudly in our current circumstances. So today we will focus on the period following the landmark civil rights movement to observe the backlash that occurred and see how the combination of power and bigotry shaped today's criminal justice system. As we consider our country's desperate need for a process of truth and reconciliation, we continue our search for more truth. As we have seen, much of it is painful, yet it is essential that we understand the history and the forces that have led us to this point. Our ability to connect past events to today's realities gives us the grounding and the impetus to take action wherever we can. So as we consider the broad issues of the US criminal justice system, recent events intervene in our knowledge and our experience. And one of the recent circumstances and the contrasts are reflected here, where we see different reactions, responses, depending upon who is protesting or acting out. So while there are numerous factors that led to the horrific assault on the Capitol on January 6th, there is also a racial dimension that is unmistakable, yet one more consequence of our country's history. A quick recap of our discussions last week. We looked at housing segregation and the FHA and the impact that that has had on our society, and that continues today. The discrimination, intentional discrimination in public policy in areas like the Social Security Act and the implementation of the GI Bill. The Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education and the massive resistance that resulted. And then some of the key events and heroic advocates of the civil rights movement that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And indeed, we are looking at yet another backlash from progress being made. In her book, White Rage, Carol Anderson talks about the ebb and flow in our public discourse and our public actions. When progress is made in an area for African Americans, there is inevitable backlash. And we are seeing clearly some of that today. And part of what we'll be talking about in this class is the impact on mass incarceration, largely initially driven by the war on drugs. So if we really look at our history and think about periods of mass incarceration or forms of mass incarceration, the first phase, of course, was slavery itself from 1640 to 1865, 225 years. Then we might consider that phase two is represented by the process known as convict leasing, where Black, largely men, were arrested and hired out. And that form of mass incarceration had similar effects to today in fracturing families and creating collateral damage to those who were involved. Our attention today will be focused on what I might call phase three, mass incarceration associated with the war on drugs. To take a snapshot, the United States is about 5% of the world's total population, and we have 25% of the world's inmates. In 1972, at the start of the period we'll be discussing today, there were about 200,000 people in jail or prison. In 2017, that number was an order of magnitude greater at 2.3 million. Today, there are 7 million Americans who are either incarcerated or on parole or probation. And all of this has had a disproportionate impact on people of color. No other country in the world imprisons its minority population at the rate that the United States does. And peripherally, collaterally, but really importantly, it is legal in the United States to discriminate against criminals. So whereas in the past, ex-slaves were discriminated against, African Americans were discriminated against because the law allowed it, as acts like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed, and it became illegal to discriminate against African Americans, it is legal to discriminate against criminals in the area of housing, jobs, public programs, education. And so while none of those are specifically defined or delineated as targeted at African Americans, because of their disproportionate participation in the criminal justice system, it has a disproportionate impact on that part of our population. So what do we know about the people who are incarcerated? If we look at statistics by ethnicity and race, we see that for every 100,000 white people in America, these are 2010 numbers, of every 100,000 white people, 380 are incarcerated. Of every 100,000 Latinos, 966. And of every 100,000 Black people, 2,207. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to this next chart because there'll be a quiz. This is a representation of the 2.3 million people who are incarcerated. 1.3 million are in state prisons, 631,000 in local jails, almost 250,000 in federal prisons and jails. Of those numbers, 450,000 of those prisoners are there because of drug offenses. 900,000 are there because of a violent crime. And more than 500,000 people are in jail awaiting trial. They haven't been convicted, they haven't even been tried, but more than 500,000 people are in jail awaiting trial. A few of them, a relatively small percentage, are considered a danger to society and not allowed bail. But most all of the rest are there because they cannot afford to pay their bail. So how did we get here? We begin in 1971 when President Nixon declared the war on drugs. One of his aides, John Ehrlichman, reported some years later that Nixon saw that he had two significant categories of enemies to his presidency. One was the anti-war left, and the other was African Americans. And so when he declared the war on drugs, he specifically targeted those two groups in the population by focusing on marijuana and heroin. He actually had marijuana declared as a Schedule I drug, along with heroin and LSD, to make sure that the penalties would be draconian enough to impact the anti-war left. During this war on drugs facilitated by Nixon, he dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies. Mandatory sentencing was introduced for the first time, and the possibility of obtaining no-knock warrants began. And his focus on law and order was a significant part of his platform and policy. And that was picked up in 1982 by President Reagan, who expanded the war on drugs. Even though illegal drug use was declining somewhat, in 1980, there were 50,000 people arrested for nonviolent drug offenses. By 1997, 400,000 people were arrested and jailed for nonviolent drug offenses. And in 1985, the drug known as crack cocaine first appeared on the scene. This period that began with Nixon and continued with significant emphasis under President Reagan marked the emergence of what we now know as dog whistles, ways of referring to circumstances and situations that sound benign on the surface, but are quite clear to the audience for whom they're intended. In 1981, Lee Atwater was a famous Republican advocate and aide. He was working on Ronald Reagan's campaign, and he was recorded as saying, you start out in 1954 saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all those things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. And so this concept of adapting vocabulary to get a message across without it appearing on the surface to be the message that you intend. Reagan spent a lot of time focusing his energy and attention and his racial appeals on diatribe against welfare cheats. He repeatedly invoked the story of the Chicago welfare queen with 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, who's collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. She's got Medicaid, she's getting food stamps, she's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. Often, Reagan placed this mythical welfare queen behind the wheel of a Cadillac, tooling around in flashy splendor. And beyond propagating the stereotypical image of a lazy, larcenous Black woman, he also looked at another stereotype, the strapping young buck standing ahead of you in the grocery store line, buying a T-bone steak with his food stamps while you are waiting in line to buy hamburger. And so these dog whistles and these terminologies have continued and spread. As we look at the war on drugs, in 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and it, for the first time, differentiated between powder and crack cocaine. Powder cocaine, because of its processing, was more expensive than crack cocaine. And so poorer people, read Black people, tended to use crack. And so there was a great deal of propagation of information about crack babies and crack women. As it turns out, pharmacologically, there is no difference between crack and powder cocaine. But the sentence for crack cocaine was 100 times higher than the sentence for powder cocaine. So if you were caught with 5 grams of crack, you received a 5-year minimum mandatory sentence. And it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to generate that same level of mandatory sentence. And those mandatory minimums were between 5 and 10 years. And it was for simple drug possession, not for sale. There were some modifications made in 1988, but the difference was still extraordinary and punitive. Now, up until this point in time, it had been Republican presidents who had been focused on law and order and illegal drug use. But when Bill Clinton was running for president, he wanted to be sure that he was seen as a new Democrat who was tough on crime, because he saw the weakness that Democratic candidates had had on the issue of law and order. And he wanted to be sure that he was not tarred with the same brush, if you will. So a little bit of background on Stone Mountain, Georgia. In 1915, the movie Birth of a Nation appeared, and it created a huge resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the South. And so following a resurrection ceremony of the Ku Klux Klan, Stone Mountain became an iconic site for American white supremacists. The group held regular events there. In the 20s, they began fundraising with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and they raised enough money to create the bas-relief sculpture that stands on Stone Mountain of Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee astride charging stallions. And every year, the Klan held its annual Labor Day cross burning at Stone Mountain. And these rallies persisted until 1991. So here's Bill Clinton running for president, wanting to show that he too is tough on crime. And so he sets up a campaign photo opportunity just before Super Tuesday primaries. And it is held at Stone Mountain, which is the site of a small federal penitentiary. And he's accompanied by Georgia's Governor Zell Miller, who was an avowed racist and white supremacist, Senator Sam Nunn, who was famous for firing his aides and assistants if he found out that they were gay, and Congressman Ben Jones. And he was a renowned advocate for the display of the Confederate flag. And as backdrop to this photo op are the incarcerated men that you see. Now, there are probably 2 or 3 white men in that group, but the overwhelming message is clear as to Bill Clinton's position in terms of continuing this war on drugs and war on crime. And so during his presidency, Congress passes in 1994 the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, the famous 3 strikes you're out, where with your 3rd conviction, the sentence is life in prison without parole, even for juveniles. More than half of those sentences were delivered in the case of nonviolent crimes. If you're convicted and sentenced to death, you are entitled to a whole range of appeal and legal support resources to help ensure that the United States doesn't execute an innocent person, heaven forbid. But if you're sentenced to life in prison without parole, there are no legal resources available to help you. You're on your own. And as has famously been said, it is better to be rich and guilty in the United States than poor and innocent. And that is precisely what's happened with this 3 strikes law. That same act introduced 60 new death penalty offenses, and it provided a new $10 billion funding for state prisons and $11 billion to state and local police forces. The U.S. Sentencing Commission was established to take a look at inequities in sentencing guidelines. And as you might expect, they determined that these disparities between crack and powder cocaine, among other aspects of the sentencing law, were grossly unfair. And so they produced a report in 1995 that recommended adjustments that would address the racial bias in sentencing. But Congress, having set up the commission, rejected the report and overrode the recommendation. And so the same sentencing guidelines continued until 2010, when the Fair Sentencing Act was finally passed. And it reduced that 100-to-1 disparity between cocaine and crack to 18-to-1. So there are still penalties, excessive penalties associated with crack cocaine. Now, part of all of this with the war on drugs is you're not sending out federal agents to every city and state to arrest people for drug offenses. So if you're going to have a federal program that focuses on law and order and drug arrests, you have to engage state and local police departments. But they're busy, they're doing stuff. And so the federal government came up with a series of incentives that would encourage state and local police departments to get involved aggressively in the war on drugs, in arresting people, charging and prosecuting, convicting and incarcerating people for drug crimes. And then so it began in 1982 with federal cash grants to make arrests for drug laws a priority. And 2 years later, Congress expanded the federal civil asset forfeiture law. I had never heard of it. It is a law where officers and agents may lawfully seize property or money from individuals that they suspect of committing or helping to commit a crime. Even if it turns out there was no crime, even if it turns out there are no charges, let alone convictions. The agents are allowed to seize initially drugs and the equipment used to manufacture them, but then it was expanded to money and securities owned by the people who were suspected or arrested for being involved with drugs. And when this law was passed in 1984, it said that the government could also seize real property. And then in 1986, it said, well, you can actually seize property that's equal to what they would have had if they'd had that other property. And so all of a sudden, the federal government was raking in millions of dollars of civil assets that were being forfeited by people suspected of committing a drug crime. And in 1984, when that law was passed, it gave the federal law enforcement agencies the right to retain those proceeds to be used exclusively for law enforcement. And at the same time, it developed something known as an equitable sharing program, where if there was a joint investigation between the state and the federal government, they got to share those proceeds. Most states had laws about how those civil assets that were seized were to be used. But if the federal government was involved, none of those state laws applied anymore. And it meant then that the funds could be used for law enforcement equipment, weapons, salaries, overtime, training, travel expenses, informant reward money, and detention facilities. So after a couple of years of this new law being in effect, the government had on hand $93 million that they had seized. And by 2013, they had on hand $4.2 billion in assets that had been seized. And so that was the net that was left after they spent the funds that they shared with state and local agencies. It's a degree of punishment associated with a civil proceeding without any constitutional protections. As I said, they can take your property. You may not end up ever even being charged, but your property is gone. And as happened, as there were budget crunches, law enforcement agencies increasingly turned to asset forfeiture seizures to compensate for budget shortfalls. And in bypassing the more restrictive state and local laws, state agencies got a much higher percentage than if they were to do this by themselves. In addition, in 1988, Congress established burn grants for narcotics task forces. So they would send money to the states for setting up narcotics task forces, setting up and staffing. And then in the 1990s began a bonus program where cash grants to the states, to the state law enforcement agencies, were based on the number of drug arrests. So the more people that you arrested for drugs, the more money that you got. And as a consequence of the states and the federal government having all this money, in the late 1990s, there were 3.4 million orders of Pentagon equipment that were shipped to state and local police organizations. And we certainly see the consequences of that today. In addition to all of this, there was some significant collateral damage, and not so minimal, really. First was the assault on the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." Well, in 1968, there was a Supreme Court decision known as Terry v. Ohio, where the court substantially expanded the police power to search and seize and limited the right to privacy as specified in the Fourth Amendment. Prior to 1968, it was generally understood that the police could not stop and search someone without a warrant unless there was probable cause to believe that the individual was engaged in criminal activity. But Terry expanded the notion of warrantless search to include suspicious behavior. And so the court affirmed that police officers could interrogate and search suspicious individuals without probable cause. And the Terry rule was actually used to target African Americans for sporting flat brim hats and hooded sweatshirts. Those were considered suspicious behavior. And then in 1996, Wren v. United States, yet another profound Supreme Court decision, allowed police to stop a person on a motor vehicle, in a motor vehicle based on a pretext. And once they had stopped the car, they had the right to search. Some people knew that that was not really a right, but they were powerless to prevent it from happening. And so law enforcement officials began stopping individuals based on previous bias or profiling, and they justified the action through various pathways, like a routine traffic stop. And actually, we've seen some videos of those in recent years. Looking at the statistics, there is a significant racial bias in stop and frisk because the suspicious behaviors observed tended to be exhibited by African American, mainly men. These arrests, these charges, just like convict leasing, but on a broader scale, disrupted social relationships. There are parts of the country where a young Black man, 1 in 3 young Black men can expect to be incarcerated during his lifetime. And as young adults, employed young adults are removed from the homes, as husbands and fathers are removed from the homes and imprisoned, sometimes for an inability to make bail, the impact on the social structure in the community is enhanced and, in fact, intensifies the kinds of stereotypes that we hear about when we think of Black families in the inner cities. It also led to the militarization of the police and the use of excessive force. All that equipment, all that military equipment in use by state and local police organizations. And if you think about it, most police forces, law enforcement agencies, have a motto or a slogan, something like protect and serve. But it's been pointed out that in the context of military activity or law enforcement, there are kind of 2 characterizations. There's the warrior and there's the guardian. And if you're in the military, you're a warrior and there's an enemy, and your job quite often is to kill the enemy. But if you're a police officer, that's not your job. Your job is to be a guardian, and a guardian of all. And so this oxymoron, if you will, of law enforcement protecting and serving and using excessive force continues. I talked about the explosion in life sentences without parole and the impact. More than half of those are for nonviolent offenses. And so if we look at the circumstances, it's fed by probation and parole. The recidivism rates are extraordinary, and in part because minor violations of probation and parole requirements can mean that you are reincarcerated even before there is any hearing on what your violation might have been. So if you look at the 7 million people who are under the auspices or the oversight of the criminal justice system, more than half of them are on probation. Almost 1 million are on parole. And there are certain requirements when you're in that state. You need to report regularly. You need to advise of a change of address. There are limitations. You're not allowed to be in possession of alcohol, certainly not a firearm. But when people leave prison and can't get a job and can't get a place to live, they end up staying with family, with friends. They move frequently. And without meaningful transportation, they can't make probation or parole appointments. They don't have the wherewithal to keep up with the requirements that are imposed upon them. And so the feeding of the system of incarceration by violations of probation and parole add to the circumstances that we see. Now, of course, we've seen an order of magnitude increase in the number of incarcerated people over this time period. And the question arises, where are we going to put them? Because the states only have so many prison cells or jail cells. And so there was a stretch of time when funds were provided as a result of one of these acts of Congress, that $10 billion that was authorized, where a new prison was being built in the United States every 2 weeks. But the subsidies ran out. The states couldn't afford to house that many prisoners. And so the capitalistic concept of private for-profit prisons stepped in to help the circumstance. In 1998, there were 5 private for-profit prisons in the US. By 2008, there were 100. And in that time period, their profits had increased by 500%. And particularly for those of us who've been involved in business, when it says for-profit prison, your performance is judged based on that bottom line. And so you ask yourself, well, what are the drivers then for success in running a private for-profit prison? And you ask yourself, so how much money, how much prospective profit are you going to spend on rehabilitation programs that would help ex-convicts, as they were then called, return to a functional life in society if it's going to have a negative effect on your bottom line? And secondarily, cynically, if those people released from prison don't have an effective employment situation or housing situation, how likely are they to come back and be another guest at your facility? And while it may seem minor, there is enormous impact, particularly on the African American community, but certainly the poor community as a whole in the United States, of the impact of cash bail and fines and fees. 25% of the men in jail in Delaware are awaiting trial, in most cases because they can't make bail. And 40% of the women in Delaware who are in jail are awaiting trial. And if they are husbands or wives and mothers, the impact on their family is dramatic. Even more bizarre, in many states like Delaware, if you owe fines and fees and you fall behind, a warrant can be issued for your arrest. And automatic with that issuance of a warrant is the suspension of your driver's license. So you can't afford to pay your fine. Probably you're working, but now you can't legally drive your car. So either you give up your job or you drive with the hopes that you won't be arrested. But if you are, then another fine and fee gets added to what you owe. There is legislation in the works at the federal level and in most states to try to take the situation and manage it more reasonably and more effectively for everyone involved, but it hasn't been passed yet. So if we look at all of this history that's led us to where we are today, today's criminal justice system in the United States, there has been this significant erosion of Fourth Amendment rights. It ultimately has the potential to affect all of us. It's just that circumstantially or typically at this point, it is less likely to affect those of us who are white and well-to-do. But our system is racialized at every single stage. A higher proportion of African Americans are stopped, are arrested after they're stopped. The charges are more severe. The bail conditions are more difficult to meet. The availability of legal representation is compromised. The whole question of plea bargain versus trial disadvantages these individuals. The sentences are longer and the appeals are harder to make. Every step. So in Boston, a number of years ago, a judge was looking at arrest rates and at sentencing, and he observed that there appeared to be a significant differential between the treatment of white people who entered the criminal justice system and those who were Black. And so he asked a study to be done, and Harvard University embarked on a 4-year study, and they reviewed more than 1 million cases in Massachusetts. And they found that out of that 665 of every 100,000 Black people were incarcerated versus 82 of every 100,000 whites for similar crimes. Blacks made up 24% of the population and 63% of the stop and frisk searches. More were detained without bail, and the bail when set was set higher. They were charged with more severe offenses than whites for essentially the same crime. And they were more frequently referred for trial to superior court. And the average sentence for the same crime was 168 days longer. And this circumstance and situation is replicated throughout the country. It's happening everywhere. And so our criminal justice system is in desperate need of reform at every level. Action is underway, but so much more is needed. And it is essential for all of us to become aware of all of the initiatives seeking to make the justice system more just and make our voices heard so that these egregious abuses of power can be corrected.
Thank you, Sue. Can you switch back to gallery view? I guess maybe I can. There we go. Well, thank you very much. It's time for discussion and to remind all of you from who were here last week, the way we're going to call on people is to have you raise the thumb button, which is down under reactions at the bottom of your screen. And when I see a thumb come up, I will call on you, and then you can unmute your microphone and then ask your question or make your comment. So we are now taking those questions or comments. You must have covered it completely. Oh,
Now
Susan.
I see Michelle's hand is up and Susan's thumb is up.
Susan?
Yeah, I live part-time in South Carolina, and recently there has been an expose in our papers that talks about the fact that 14% of the population is Black, but they represent 37% of the arrests or stops by local police. So it continues to this day.
And it's everywhere.
Yeah, it is everywhere. And what can you do about it? There's just no rationale to explain why it is.
Actually, there is absolutely a rationale to explain why it is. It's just
yeah,
that the
because
use
they're
of
Black.
rational in the midst of that word is the part that's that's the difficulty. I think based on the history, we see exactly why it is, but it is difficult to justify in any sense based on what we know of the circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remain a citizen of Pennsylvania, even though it is financially advantageous for me to switch my residency, but I cannot bring myself to say I live in a bigoted, backward state of South Carolina. It costs me money, but I don't care. I can't do it. I just can't.
Based on the representation that you would be receiving in South Carolina from your recently re-elected senator, probably
yeah,
could...
that and and the legislation that's going on against LGBTQs and transgender kids and Blacks and everything that's not white Southern Baptist. And I can't do it.
In almost every state, there is work underway on legislation to try to address these issues with the criminal justice system. In Delaware, there's an organization, a subset of the ACLU called Smart Justice Delaware. And 2 years ago, they introduced 19 bills into the state legislature to begin to address some of the worst of the issues. 11 of those bills were enacted. Now, they were the more minor corrective events, but it began to build some impetus, some enthusiasm, some commitment for more work to be done. The work is enormous. Progress is being made, but it's really important that we're aware of what those initiatives are and that we're able to speak out and support them so that representatives know that we're paying attention and that we think it's important.
Well, and I keep writing letters to the editor, to the local paper, to say, this is the most racist, backward state I have ever lived in. Sorry, I cannot commit to saying I'm a resident here. Because there is no progressive movement. There's nothing afoot to change this. That's all I can do.
Thanks, Susan. I think Michelle had her hand up. It wasn't her thumb, but it was her hand. You're on
Michelle, you
mute.
need to unmute.
Oh, okay. I just want to vent, if that's okay. Well, it happened here in Delaware, 20-minute drive to work. And so I was stopped by one police car in an SUV. I'm not saying SUV, state police. I will say it's state police because I wasn't in Dover. 20-minute drive south to work. And what happened? I'm not sure. All I remember, the ticket was $360. I wasn't speeding, which is like that'd be rational. I didn't run a red light, but that's not all of it. I'm not sure what the ticket was for, but I remember it was $360 and I was 2.5 hours late for work. Anyway, I called the store manager, after about an hour had passed. I said, I'm going to be late because I was stopped by the police. I couldn't say why. I didn't know why. But what really irks me, in addition to the $360 ticket, is the 4 police cars. And then I'm here fuming. I said, boy, I'm paying for you to drive around in 4 SUVs. It was warm, air conditioning. And I said, I'm paying for your pension, I'm paying your salary. I was furious. I didn't tell them that, but I'm just fuming in my car. I didn't get out of my car. I didn't get out. 4 police cars, $360, 2.5 hours late for work. Then I had to explain to the patients why. And I really didn't have a response. And so they're late for their appointments. I mean, it's a 20-minute drive. And I said, now, do I fight this ticket? I have to take a day off work. I have to schedule that and will have no say in when I can schedule it, if I can even arrange to get the day off. It was just furious. 4 police cars. And I can't remember, I don't know what the ticket was for. I couldn't tell you that, but it wasn't speeding. Didn't run a red light. But I just had to vent about that. I fume about that now, every now and then. It's like, and this all brought it back up. I wasn't turning. I wasn't turning. Okay. So that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to vent.
I guess
Thank you, Michelle.
the thing is what threat did she present that required the police officer to wait for 3 other police cars in a stop of a, mother of, at that time, I guess, still middle-aged woman. And no guns, nothing suspicious.
20 minutes south of here.
But she had to wait for the other police cars to show up.
Well, and it has to be terrifying because you know the sorts of things that happen. And to have a circumstance where not only do you not have any control, you don't even have any concept of
Right.
what might happen.
But I'm
what's-
paying their
what's likely to
salaries. I
happen.
pay taxes.
Okay, okay.
But you know, one of
I
the
don't
things
like
that's
how my money's being spent.
one of the things that's happened with these, it's called fines and fees for a reason. And in Delaware, at least, you can be fined $100 for a parking violation. But then fees are added on. There's a public defender fee, there's a fire department fee, there's a police pension fee. There are all of these fees that have been added on to the fines so that a $100 fine for a parking violation, you suddenly owe more than $500. And more than that, trying to fix it, trying to say this is no way to fund governmental operations. You have all of these groups who are getting money from these fees who are in opposition to reforming the system because
Okay.
it is the source of funding for their department's activities. It's insane. It's insane.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Junius,
Hello, I'd just like to make a comment about the war on drugs. So I'm currently at University of Michigan and I attended University of Delaware as well. And in my experience, even being at UD, a lot of people that I saw deal drugs or use of drugs are actually white students, which wasn't too surprising to me. I went to a frat party, saw pills on the table, and immediately left the house because I was like, if this place gets raided, they're gonna look at me and associate me and everybody else here as using the drugs, even though I don't do any of that kind of activity. But also being at University of Michigan, Halloween is like one of the largest times on campus. There's a lot of parties that use like Percocets, LSD, MDMA, which is ecstasy. And even on Drugs Incorporated on National Geographic, they did a study of Detroit and they went to University of Michigan and saw a student around in Central Campus buying drugs from a drug dealer, and both were white. And I was like, this is wow, this is crazy. Because now with this current opioid crisis caused by Purdue Pharma, now you look at the way that addicts are treated and it's more of a healthcare issue. When then you look at the crack cocaine, they're more of a criminal issue. And that's just, I just find that crazy. And they never go after, and they never wonder how are the drugs getting into the country. China, you know, most of the precursors for the drugs, because I'm in organic chemistry, I know how they make these things. Most of the precursors for the drugs are actually from China. And then you have to look at how are they getting into the country? What's the largest ports in the country? Newark, New Jersey has a large port, Baltimore, Maryland. So they get the drug dealers, which are the foot soldiers, but how is it getting in the country? Who owns the airlines? Who owns the ships? So it's always, you know, get the bottom man, but you're not getting the kingpins. You're not doing anything to really stop this introduction into the country. So I just want to make that point.
Yeah, thank you, Junius. In fact, study after study has been done that says that Blacks and whites use illegal drugs at about the same rates. And given that the Black population is significantly smaller than the white population, if the rate of usage is the same, you would expect that there would be a higher rate of arrests and charges against whites, but there's not. And that's indicative of all of these things, that these forces and these beliefs and this history that we've been talking about. And in reality, the call to treat the opioid crisis as a public health crisis is entirely appropriate, but all of this drug usage before, it was appropriate to treat it as a public health crisis as well. And it wasn't. It was treated as a crime because it was directed at a different population. So thank you.
anyone else?
Cindy.
One of the things that years back I recall was drugs moved into the business sector in a big way. And so a lot of the manufacturing and the people who are wheeling and dealing the drugs are in corporate offices now and are white. And so it's moved into this perspective of it's a business like anything else. Sort of when the prisons became a for-profit thing, the drugs moved into a higher scale. And so many times all of these drugs are being manufactured at a very high end by rich white people. And then, you know, they trickle down to, and how do they get distributed? They find people at the lower socioeconomic thing to distribute them, but they're being manufactured by very wealthy people, and it's a huge business. And so that's a whole nother reason for the war on drugs to sort of be a misnomer, because it's a for-profit business by many, many people.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thought I saw that Mike Soltis.
Mike Soltis.
Hi, I just wanted to raise, sorry, this is Topher Soltis. I just wanted to raise that in terms of the question around drug enforcement, that there have been some studies suggesting that the enforcement of drug policies doesn't actually disinhibit sale of drugs. It just raises the prices and increases the profit, because you're sort of, the economics means that you're adding a premium, a sort of danger premium onto the price of drugs. And therefore, you know, anytime you add the total, increase the total cost, you're increasing total profit as well. And so rather than disincentivizing, the enforcement actually just increases the profit to the higher rungs of the chain.
Interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, seeing no hands up, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to use the same Zoom link next week, and I don't think we had anybody locked out today, so that was good. Next week's topic is voter suppression, then and now. And certainly voter suppression has been in the news and continues to be in the news, as many states are trying to enact laws that will make voter suppression even more than it is today. So that's it for today. Next Saturday, same time, we will still be in Maui. So we will probably have a little more suntan, we hope. But we may also have a Mai Tai in our hands, who knows? And for those of you with direct Michigan links, today's game today was disappointing, to lose to Ohio State by 1 point in basketball. So we can't end on a bad note. Go Blue. And thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Bye.
Thank you.
Enjoy Maui.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for being here.
Thank you.